Hello, I'm Mr. Munro. I'm the senior leader responsible for our formal curriculum and assessment, and this presentation is looking at what we're calling From the Front Teaching. The first presentations in this series of 3 expectations evening presentations covered the curriculum this year and how that's been adapted in the light of the restrictions on us through COVID-19. Today I'm going to talk about teaching and learning, and next week we'll be talking about the most effective use of devices for home learning. I'd like to start this with a little recap of what I spoke about to Key Stage 3 parents last week, most of which was also included in Ms. Powley's presentation. We started by talking about the curriculum journey. That's how our teams have viewed the content of what they're doing over a 7-year period from year 7 to year 13, always aiming at increasing expertise. Then within that we spoke about the knowledge organiser, where we've included that range of stuff which students have to know completely as part of their learning and each stage of their learning. And within that I also spoke to you about the idea of fluency. For Key Stage 3 parents, I reminded you about how we start and talk about that journey from our learning being initial to becoming complete and fluent. And that's also something that Ms. Powley referenced quite frequently in her presentation. Those of you who have been regulars in our presentations in the hall may well look at this slideshow and remember something I've spoken about previously. And that's this idea of when we learn something new, what we have to do, we have to encode that knowledge, then store it in our long-term memories so that we can retrieve it when we need to, either for an exam for some of our students or when we actually need to use the knowledge in our daily lives. When we encode something new, we set it in that schema of everything else we already know about the subject. So we set it in all those bits of knowledge we've had about that subject previously and indeed other subjects previously. The process of storing is what we're going to talk about at greater length today, how work goes into our longer term memories so that we can retrieve it. Ms. Powley's mantra in her presentation to Key Stage 4 and 5 parents was, "It's not learned if it's not repeated." But we're going to concentrate tonight at that idea of how we store knowledge and how as teachers we're going to be able to check for your children's understanding so that we know we're ready to move on. And I'm going to talk most specifically about strategies that you should be expecting your child to see that you can ask them about when they're at home with you about their days in school. The first strategy I want to talk about is low stakes testing. If I think back to my time at school, that word test filled me with horror. It was that idea that it was something to be passed or failed. It was something where I was trying to beat my friends more often than not. I want to think about testing in a different way. Testing in a way that really enables our teachers to understand how much students know, both before and after they've taught it, and gives the students the chance to understand where the gaps in their knowledge are. And we talk about 2 types of testing in our school. One is the idea of the pre-test. That's the test when you test children's knowledge before they've even started learning something. Now what that can demonstrate to you as a teacher is that actually the children know the stuff already, or a lot of them know it quite well, so we can adapt the way we're going to be teaching them. But actually there's an advantage that comes in testing someone on material that you've not taught them yet, and that's what we call test potentiated learning. By asking some questions before we start something, the brain already starts to engage with that material and starts thinking, okay, this is something I'm going to need to find out and learn about. A pre-test can be something we do as a single lesson strategy. It could be something we do over a series of lessons covering material that will be taught over several weeks. But it's a strategy that can be used in both contexts. So if your child talks about pre-tests, Well, that's what we're using with them. If you have a pre-test, then logically you also have the idea of a post-test. That's the sort of thing that probably we're more used to as adults from our experiences as children. The test that we get at the end of something, when we've covered that material, when we've had the opportunity to practice it independently, and independent practice is something that Ms. Powley and I both spoke about in our first presentations. That gives us as learners and teachers an idea of where they are on that journey to knowing something completely. If your child has learnt and practiced independently the content of their knowledge organiser, then that post-test will show that they know that material completely. Low stakes testing is a key part of our formative assessing strategies as we shape our curriculum. This next idea is less to do with assessing and more to do with actually how we're introducing that material after perhaps a pre-test. And this is the idea of I, we, you. I, the teacher, do something first. We, the whole class, do something together. Then you, the students, do it individually. And that's the idea of modelling. When I do something for the first time, I talk you through all the processes I'm using in order to do it. Then we need to start some guided practice of that collectively. So we, as a class, will be writing an answer to a question, a solution to a problem. It might even be in PE, serving a tennis ball or a practical skill. I've written underneath those things, I and we, the things that we'll be using in the classroom to support that. A whiteboard is fairly old hat as a piece of technology. You know what that is. It's our writing on the whiteboard in front of the class. A visualizer is something which enables a teacher to project onto the screen what they're writing on a book or on a piece of paper in front of them. And that's linked to the computer and shows it on the screen. When we're doing something together, and when I'm questioning individuals about little parts of what we're doing, and I'm saying, why are we doing that? What word might I write in that gap there? The strategy I'm probably going to use there is a mini whiteboard. And I'm going to come back to mini whiteboards in a minute. And indeed, when it moves on to the you, when it moves on to the student individually doing something, then probably a strategy we're most likely to see, so that teachers can see what students are doing, is the use again of the mini whiteboard. So, modelling new concepts through I, we, you from the front is something we're going to see more often. In establishing whether it's time to move on, in establishing whether or not students have got it, we've worked carefully with our teachers on the concept of the Hinge question. So what's a Hinge question? It's the type of question that shows that if students get it right, we're ready to move from one activity to the next. And students need to get it right because understanding the first bit of the lesson is a prerequisite for being able to understand the second bit. I need to think carefully about the question that I'm asking in order to know that my class are ready for me to teach them the next bit. As a language teacher, I want to know that my children in front of me understand all of my subject pronouns before I can start teaching them how a verb ending changes depending on that subject pronoun. When I'm asking that Hinge question, I want to understand why students are getting it wrong. I want to see the type of the mistakes that they're making so I can deal with those misconceptions right now before I let those misconceptions embed and move on to the second thing. So, Hinge questions, a strategy that will help us check for students' understanding. And now I'm going to answer this question. Why mini whiteboards? And I can speak about this with the zeal of a convert. As a teacher, I used to see whiteboards as a bit of a gimmick. I've deliberately chosen a picture of a primary school because I might have thought to myself, that's a bit of a primary school strategy. Surely by now, this class of year 9s has outgrown the business of the mini whiteboard. I want to tell you now that I was wrong, and I'm going to explain to you why I was wrong and why actually mini whiteboards are probably the key strategy that we will be using as teachers in understanding whether or not your children have really got what we're trying to teach them. Well-used mini whiteboards demand 100% participation. If I'm asking students questions individually and I have 30 children in the class, I might hope optimistically that all 30 of them are thinking and preparing an answer for me. I know after enough years of experience that realistically they aren't. If I am demanding that they show me an answer on a whiteboard, I know that every child has to think. And as we shared with you in the expectation evenings last year, we know that learning happens when children think hard. There's nowhere to hide. You can't hide by not putting your hand up. You can't hide by not looking at the teacher and hoping you're not going to get picked. All those strategies that we used to use when we were at school. There's nowhere to hide. You have to think. They provide us as teachers with instant feedback of whether or not the children have got it. If I'm asking a class a Hinge question, I want to be able to scan that room and know whether or not 30 children do or don't know the answer. The great thing about them is they're simple. Over the years I've tried all sorts of clever ways of getting class feedback that have used all sorts of smart and clever technology. A mini whiteboard which is set out at the start of a lesson, which requires one pen and one rubber, is a dead easy piece of technology for me to use. It can't go wrong. And on that idea of wrongness, the great thing about a mini whiteboard is you wipe it out. When we practice in our books, we know there are some students who hate getting things wrong, who hate having to make corrections to their work. There is no permanence on a mini whiteboard. There's no record of what you wrote on it. There should be less fear of actually trying something and getting it wrong, because we also know as learners and adults that actually it's in the getting it wrong and as teachers understanding why we're getting it wrong that ultimately we get better, that knowledge is stored and that it becomes permanent. And a final thing I want to talk about is the marking of books. You will be aware that we're operating under very complicated rules to do with how quickly we can turn around marking a student's book. The quarantining of paper for 72 hours when it's been out of a school environment means effectively it's a week for being able to mark work. That simply isn't quick enough for the challenges we're facing within our curriculum this year, with students having been out of being in the school building for the best part of 6 months. The strategies that we'll use where we can to help us with this are really driving the use of Firefly. Firefly for submitting tasks, Firefly for marking tasks, Firefly for feedback. Using Firefly for online quizzing, using other online resources that we want students to be using so we can see what they can and can't do and can see it quickly. Where students are producing work on paper, then you'll see more strategies in school for students marking the work themselves. Students marking the work themselves isn't our teachers getting out of taking home 30 books, because that will take too long to deal with the business of feedback to you. Students marking works themselves mean our teachers get instant feedback and can instantly plan what they'll be doing in that lesson or the next. It means they can spend more time in the planning of quality lessons for your children, so that we can make up for any gaps that have emerged in the time of lockdown. I hope you found this presentation to be useful in explaining a little bit to you about the strategies we'll be using this year. If you do have any questions about anything I've spoken about, then you can see my email address on the screen there, and I'll be very happy to talk to you about any queries.